Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earth defense ship Valiant and watched the holographic screen flicker to life before him. The image showed 3 alien faces staring back at him with expressions that ranged from boredom to outright contempt. He had seen these faces before, and each time they appeared it meant trouble for humanity. The Galactic Council was calling again, and Jake already knew what they wanted. They always wanted something from Earth, and they never asked politely. The central figure on the screen was Ambassador Threll of the Zenthari Empire. His 3 eyes blinked in sequence as his translator device converted his clicking speech into human words. The message was delivered in that same condescending tone that Jake had grown to despise over the past few years. Humanity was required to surrender another portion of their asteroid mining operations in the belt. They were also expected to accept new travel restrictions that would limit human ships to pre-approved routes only. The tribute payments that Earth sent to the Council every quarter would be increased by another 15%. Ambassador Threll explained these demands as if they were simple facts of life and not the slow strangulation of an entire species. Jake felt his jaw tighten as he listened, but he kept his face neutral. He had been dealing with the Council for 3 years now, and he had learned that showing emotion only made them more aggressive. The aliens seemed to enjoy watching humans squirm under their demands. When the transmission ended, Jake turned to his communications officer and told him to forward the message to Admiral Lisa Parker at Fleet Command. Then he walked to the observation deck and stared out at the stars. 15 years had passed since humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel. It had been the greatest moment in human history when the first ship had jumped beyond the solar system and proved that the universe was within reach. The celebrations had lasted for weeks, and every nation on Earth had united in pride at what they had accomplished together. Then they had met the Galactic Council, and everything had changed. The Council was made up of 7 major species, who had divided the galaxy among themselves over thousands of years. They had rules and regulations for everything, and they enforced those rules with overwhelming military force. When humanity had arrived in Council space, the aliens had not welcomed them with open arms. Instead, they had immediately imposed restrictions on where humans could travel and what resources they could claim. The Council declared that Earth was a minor species and would remain under their authority until they proved themselves worthy of independence. That had been 15 years ago, and the restrictions had only grown tighter with each passing year. Admiral Lisa Parker received the transmission from the Valiant while she was in her meeting with her senior staff at the Lunar Command Station. She watched the message twice before she spoke, and when she did, her voice was cold and flat. She told her officers that this was the last time. The Council had pushed too far for too long, and humanity had given them everything they had asked for. Earth had surrendered colonies that could have housed billions. They had abandoned mining operations that would have made humanity wealthy beyond measure. They had paid tribute until the planetary economy struggled under the weight. Now the Council wanted more, and Admiral Parker was done giving. Commander Greg Hayes spoke up from across the table. He was a career military officer who had served in the defense fleet since its creation, and he had watched the Council humiliate humanity over and over again. He asked the Admiral what she planned to do, and she told him that she was going to refuse the Council's demands. The room went silent. Everyone knew what that meant. The Council did not accept refusal, and they had destroyed entire civilizations for less. Lieutenant Amy Brooks was the youngest officer in the room, but she was also one of the smartest. She had graduated top of her class at the academy and had been handpicked by Admiral Parker for her strategic mind. She pulled up a display showing the current disposition of Council forces in the sector and pointed out that most of their fleet was concentrated around their core worlds. The border regions where humanity operated were lightly defended because the Council had never considered Earth a military threat. If humanity was going to make a stand, this was the time to do it. Admiral Parker nodded and told her staff to begin implementing the contingency plans they had been developing in secret for the past 5 years. While the Council had been busy squeezing humanity for tribute and resources, Earth's military and scientific community had been working on something else. They had been building weapons and developing tactics specifically designed to counter Council technology. Humanity had studied every battle record they could access and had analyzed every piece of alien technology they could get their hands on. They had learned the Council's weaknesses, and they had prepared for this moment. The first step was to send a message, and Admiral Parker recorded it herself. She sat in front of the camera in her full dress uniform and spoke directly to every member of the Galactic Council. She told them that humanity would no longer accept their demands. Earth would no longer surrender resources or territory. Humans would no longer pay tribute to species who treated them like servants. The age of human submission was over, and any attempt to enforce Council authority would be met with force. She ended the transmission and ordered it sent on every available channel across the galaxy. President Daniel Ross received a copy of the Admiral's message 10 minutes before it went public. He sat in the Oval Office with his advisors and watched as Admiral Parker declared what amounted to war on the most powerful alliance in the known galaxy. His chief of staff asked if he was going to countermand the order and stop the transmission. President Ross thought about it for exactly 3 seconds before he shook his head. He told his staff to draft a statement supporting Admiral Parker's position and to make it clear that the decision had his full backing. Earth was done bowing to alien masters. The message reached the Galactic Council chambers within an hour. Ambassador Threll was in the middle of a routine session when his aide interrupted with an urgent communication. He watched Admiral Parker's message with growing disbelief and then with rage. Around him, the other council members were having similar reactions. The Krillian representative demanded immediate military action. The Quellian ambassador suggested that perhaps humanity deserved to be heard. Threll silenced them both and called for an emergency vote on sanctions against Earth. The vote passed unanimously among the major powers. Captain Jake Morrison received new orders. While the Valiant was still on patrol, Admiral Parker was mobilizing the fleet, and Jake's ship was being reassigned to a battle group forming near Epsilon Station. That station was one of the disputed territories that the Council had demanded Earth abandon months ago. Now humanity was not only refusing to leave but was reinforcing the position. Jake knew what that meant, and so did his crew. They were going to war. The Council's response came faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours of Admiral Parker's message, Ambassador Threll appeared on every major news channel across human space. His 3 eyes blazed with fury as he delivered the Council's ultimatum. Earth had 72 hours to withdraw all military forces from disputed territories and to arrest Admiral Parker for crimes against galactic peace. If humanity refused, then the Council would take military action and the consequences would be severe. President Ross watched the transmission from the White House and then turned to his communication director and told him to ignore it completely. There would be no response and no negotiation. Captain Jake Morrison brought the Valiant into formation with 19 other human warships near Epsilon Station. The station itself was a massive structure that served as a waypoint for ships traveling through the sector. It had strategic value because it sat at the junction of 3 major trade routes, and whoever controlled it could monitor all traffic passing through the region. The Council had demanded that humanity abandon the station 6 months ago, but Earth had stalled and delayed until now. Admiral Parker had decided that Epsilon Station would be the line in the sand where humanity made its stand. Commander Chloe Wright commanded the destroyer Defiant, and her ship took up position on the fleet's left flank. She had served under Admiral Parker for 8 years, and she trusted her commander completely, but she also knew what they were facing. The Council had never lost a military engagement in recorded history. They had weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand sustained bombardment for days. Human technology was newer and less tested. Everything depended on whether the theories and simulations that Earth's scientists had developed would work in actual combat. The Krillian Dominion sent 6 warships to remove the human presence from Epsilon Station. The Krillians were one of the Council's most aggressive members, and they had been pushing for military action against Earth for years. Their ships were massive things that bristled with plasma cannons and carried enough firepower to level a city. The lead ship was twice the size of the Valiant, and its commander sent a standard warning message telling the humans to withdraw immediately or be destroyed. Captain Morrison received the message and forwarded it to Admiral Parker, who was monitoring the situation from her flagship 3 light-years away. Her response was simple: hold the line. The Krillian ships moved into attack formation and their weapons began to glow with gathering energy. Captain Morrison gave the order and every human ship brought their shields to maximum power and charged their weapons. The new shield technology that Earth had developed was based on principles that the Council had never explored. Instead of trying to stop incoming fire with raw energy, the human shields redirected and dispersed the attacks across a wider area. It was more efficient and required less power, but no one knew if it would actually work against Council. Weapons. The Krillians opened fire and space lit up with plasma bolts that streaked across the void toward the human fleet. The first impacts hit the Valiant's shields, and Morrison felt his ship shudder under the assault. For a moment he thought the shields would fail, but then the energy dissipated across the hull and the ship stabilized. The shields were holding. All across the fleet, the same thing was happening as human ships absorbed fire that should have destroyed them. The Krillian commander must have been shocked because there was a noticeable pause before the second volley came. Morrison didn't wait for the Krillians to adjust their tactics. He gave the order to return fire, and the human fleet unleashed their railguns. These weapons were different from anything the Council used. Instead of energy weapons, the railguns fired solid projectiles at incredible speeds, using magnetic acceleration. The projectiles were small, but they were moving at a significant fraction of light speed, and they hit with devastating kinetic energy. The first volley caught the Krillians completely off guard. Their shields were designed to handle plasma and energy weapons, not physical projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. 3 Krillian ships took critical hits in the first exchange. One of them lost power completely and began drifting. Another had its main weapon array torn off by a railgun slug that punched straight through their shields and armor. The third ship exploded when a projectile hit their reactor core. The remaining 3 Krillian ships tried to adjust their formation, but Commander Wright saw the opportunity and led her destroyer on a flanking attack that caught them from the side. The Defiant's railguns hammered one of the ships until its hull breached and atmosphere vented into space. The Krillian commander realized he was beaten and ordered a retreat. The 2 remaining ships turned and jumped to faster than light speed, leaving their damaged vessels behind. Captain Morrison couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The entire engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes, and humanity had just won its first battle against the Galactic Council. He ordered his crew to secure the damaged Krillian ships and to render aid to any survivors. Then he sent a message to Admiral Parker with a simple report. The line had been held. The battle was broadcast across the galaxy within hours. Every species with access to communication networks saw the footage of human ships defeating Krillian warships. The Council had always seemed invincible, and now that image was shattered. Admiral Parker knew that this was just the beginning. The Council would respond with greater force, and humanity needed to be ready. She called a meeting with her senior commanders and told them to prepare for a major engagement. The Council would not let this defeat stand unanswered. On Earth, Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Phillips coordinated the defense of the home system. He worked with military planners to position ships and weapons platforms around Earth and the other inhabited worlds. If the Council decided to strike at humanity's heart, they would find it well defended. Meanwhile, Dr. Helen Carter and her research team worked around the clock to produce more of the weapons and shield systems that had proven so effective at Epsilon Station. Every factory on Earth and the colonies was converted to military production. News of the battle reached the smaller species who existed under Council rule. The Torvani were a peaceful trading people who had suffered under Council taxation for centuries. When they heard that humanity had defeated Krillian warships, their merchants began to whisper among themselves. Perhaps the Council was not as powerful as they claimed. Perhaps resistance was possible after all. Similar conversations were happening among dozens of minor species across the galaxy. Ambassador Threll convened an emergency session of the Council and demanded immediate action. The Krillians wanted revenge, and they called for a massive fleet to be assembled to crush humanity once and for all. The other Council members agreed. They could not allow this challenge to go unanswered, or other species might get the same idea. Within days, the Council began gathering the largest military force seen in decades. Over 200 ships from 6 different species would form an armada that would sweep the humans aside and remind the galaxy who held power. The Galactic Council assembled their fleet at the Vortan staging grounds, which was a massive military complex on the edge of Council space. Over 200 warships gathered there, representing 6 different species and 3 different military doctrines. The Zenthari brought their heavy cruisers with their thick armor and powerful energy shields. The Krillians arrived with their plasma cannon destroyers, hungry for revenge after their defeat at Epsilon Station. The Quilleen contributed long-range missile frigates, while the other species added their own vessels to the growing armada. It was the largest military force assembled in over 50 years, and its purpose was singular. Humanity would be crushed and made an example for any other species who might consider defying the Council. High Commander Vorath of the Zinthari Empire took overall command of the fleet. He was a veteran of dozens of campaigns and had never lost a battle in his 40 years of service. He looked at humanity as nothing more than an irritation that needed to be eliminated quickly, so the Council could return to more important matters. His battle plan was straightforward. The fleet would jump to human space near the Tyrell Nebula and advance in overwhelming force toward Earth. Any human ships encountered would be destroyed, and Earth itself would be blockaded until the planet surrendered. Unconditionally, Admiral Parker received intelligence reports about the Council fleet from Commander Steve Logan, who ran human reconnaissance operations. Logan had managed to place spy drones near the Vortan staging grounds, and the data they collected was transmitted back to Earth in regular bursts. The numbers were staggering. 200 ships was more than 10 times the size of Earth's entire military fleet. Parker knew that meeting such a force in open battle would be suicide. Humanity needed a different approach. She called a meeting with her top strategists at the Lunar Command Station. Captain Morrison attended via holographic link from the Valiant. Commander Greg Hayes was there in person along with Lieutenant Ben Foster, who had proven himself to be a brilliant tactical analyst despite his young age. Parker laid out the problem for them. The Council fleet was too large to fight directly, but if they didn't fight at all, then Earth would be blockaded and starved into submission. They needed a way to turn the Council's size against them. Lieutenant Foster studied the intelligence reports for several hours before he proposed an idea. The Council fleet was made up of ships from multiple species who used different communication protocols and tactical doctrines. They would need time to coordinate their actions, and that coordination would break down if they were forced to fight in difficult conditions. Foster suggested using the Tyrell Nebula itself as a weapon. The nebula was filled with radiation storms and magnetic anomalies that would interfere with sensors and communications. If the human fleet could lure the Council forces into the nebula and then strike from unexpected angles, they might be able to create enough chaos to level the playing. Field Admiral Parker considered the plan carefully. It was risky and would require perfect timing and coordination from every human ship. If anything went wrong, the entire fleet could be trapped and destroyed. But if they didn't take the risk, then Earth would fall anyway. She approved the plan and gave orders for the fleet to deploy near the Tyrell Nebula. Every available warship was pulled from patrol duties and defense posts. Humanity was committing everything to this one battle. Captain Kate Sullivan commanded the carrier Horizon, which was the largest ship in the human fleet. Her vessel carried 200 small fighters that were designed for hit-and-run attacks. The fighters were fast and maneuverable, but lightly armed, and their success would depend on using the nebula's interference to mask their approach. Sullivan briefed her pilots personally and told them that this battle would determine whether humanity remained free or became slaves to the Council. Every pilot understood what was at stake. The Council fleet arrived at the edge of the Tyrell Nebula 3 days later. High Commander Vorath was surprised to find human ships waiting for him. He had expected them to defend Earth itself, not to meet him in open space. His tactical officers reported that the humans had positioned themselves inside the nebula's outer radiation fields, where sensors were degraded. Vorath considered this a foolish move because the same conditions that hurt his sensors would hurt the humans as well. He ordered the fleet to advance in standard formation and to sweep the humans aside. The Council ships entered the nebula and immediately began experiencing communication difficulties. The magnetic storms interfered with their long-range transmissions, and ships had to rely on short-range systems to coordinate. Vorath ordered his ships to tighten their formation to maintain contact, but this made them more concentrated and less able to maneuver. He was still confident because his fleet had overwhelming numerical superiority. Captain Morrison watched from the Valiant as the Council ships pushed deeper into the nebula. His orders were to hold position until Admiral Parker gave the signal. The human ships were scattered throughout the nebula in small groups, each one positioned near a radiation storm or magnetic anomaly. They waited in silence with all non-essential systems powered down to avoid detection. Morrison could feel the tension on his bridge as his crew watched the Council fleet approach. Admiral Parker monitored the battle from her command ship, which was positioned just outside the nebula. She watched as the Council fleet moved into position, and waited until they were fully committed before she gave the order to attack. Across the nebula, human ships powered up their systems and began moving. Captain Sullivan launched her fighters in waves, and they dove into the radiation storms using the interference to hide their approach. Commander Greg Hayes led a squadron of destroyers in a flanking attack that came from below the Council, formation where they weren't expecting resistance. The first strikes caught the Council completely off guard. Human fighters appeared out of radiation clouds and hammered Council ships with railgun fire, before disappearing back into the interference. Hayes and his destroyers crippled a Xanthari cruiser and destroyed 2 Krillian ships before the Council could respond. Vorath tried to organize a counterattack, but his orders were delayed by communication problems, and different parts of his fleet received conflicting instructions. Captain Morrison led the Valiant in a direct assault on the Council flagship. His railguns punched through the flagship's shields and caused significant damage to their command systems. Vorath found himself unable to coordinate his fleet as his communication arrays were damaged, and he lost contact with large portions of his force. Individual Council ships began making their own tactical decisions, which led to confusion and friendly fire incidents. A Krillian destroyer accidentally fired on a Quilleen frigate in the chaos. The battle raged for 6 hours, and the nebula was lit up with weapons fire and explosions. Human ships continued their hit-and-run tactics, never staying in one place long enough for the Council to bring their superior numbers to bear. Captain Sullivan's fighters proved devastatingly effective as they struck from unexpected angles and disappeared before retaliation could be organized. The Council's numerical advantage became a liability as ships collided with each other, and the confusion and coordination broke down completely. When the fighting finally ended, the Council fleet was shattered. 70 ships had been destroyed, and more than twice that number were damaged. The survivors retreated in disorder, leaving behind wreckage and disabled vessels. The human fleet had losses too. 15 ships were destroyed and many more were damaged, but they held the field. Admiral Parker broadcast a message to the Council on all channels. Humanity had defended itself, and any future attacks would be met with the same result. The price of aggression would only grow higher. The defeat at Tyrell Nebula sent shockwaves through the Galactic Council that reached far beyond the military losses. Ambassador Threll stood before the Council chambers and tried to explain how a fleet of 200 ships had been defeated by a force less than a quarter of its size. The Krillian representative interrupted him repeatedly and demanded to know why the Xanthari commander had been so incompetent. The Xanthari delegate fired back that Krillian ships had caused as much damage to their own allies as the humans had. Within an hour, the Council session had devolved into accusations and blame that echoed through the chamber. The political unity that had held the Council together for 3 centuries was cracking under the pressure. The smaller member species, who had always followed the lead of the Xanthari and Krillians, began to question whether the war with humanity was worth the cost. The Quilleen ambassador stood and suggested that perhaps the Council should consider negotiating with Earth. His suggestion was met with outrage from the major powers, but several other delegates nodded in agreement. The foundation of Council authority was beginning to crumble. On Earth, President Daniel Ross addressed the people of humanity in a broadcast that was transmitted to every colony and station in human space. He told them that they had won a great victory, but the war was far from over. The Council would not give up easily, and humanity needed to prepare for what came next. Earth needed allies and needed them quickly. Ross announced that he was sending diplomatic missions to species across the galaxy who might share humanity's grievances against the Council. If Earth stood alone, then eventually the Council would find a way to overwhelm them. But if humanity could build a coalition, then the balance of power would shift. Ambassador Claire Hughes was chosen to lead the diplomatic effort. She was a career diplomat who had spent years negotiating with alien species, and she understood how galactic politics worked. Her first mission was to the Torvani Collective, which was a peaceful trading confederation that controlled several important trade routes. The Torvani had always been neutral in galactic conflicts, but they had suffered under Council taxation and trade restrictions for decades. Hughes thought they might be receptive to an alliance with humanity. She arrived at the Torvani homeworld aboard a small diplomatic shuttle and was greeted by Pellin, who was one of their merchant princes. The Torvani were slender beings with 4 arms and smooth gray skin, who valued trade and commerce above all else. Pellin listened carefully as Hughes explained what humanity was offering. Earth would guarantee Torvani access to human markets and would protect their trade ships from Council interference. In exchange, the Torvani would share intelligence about Council activities and would allow human ships to use their trade routes. Pelon was cautious at first because aligning with humanity meant risking Council retaliation, but he was also a shrewd businessman and he could see which way the wind was blowing. The Council's defeat at Tyrell Nebula had shown that they were not invincible. If humanity continued to grow stronger, then being their ally would be more profitable than remaining neutral. After 3 days of negotiation, Pelon agreed to a trade and intelligence sharing agreement. It was not a military alliance, but it was a start. While Hughes was negotiating with the Torvani captain, Jake Morrison was leading a different kind of diplomatic mission. Admiral Parker had sent him to make contact with the Vryn Collective, which was a loose association of warrior clans who valued strength and personal honor above everything else. The Vryn had always resented the Council's attempts to regulate their behavior, and they had fought several small wars to maintain their independence. Morrison thought they might respect humanity's recent victories enough to consider an alliance. The Vryn homeworld was a harsh place with heavy gravity and a thin atmosphere. Morrison met with Warlord Kresh, who was the leader of the largest Vryn clan. Kresh was massive even by Vryn standards, and his body was covered in scars from countless battles. He looked at Morrison with eyes that evaluated him as a potential threat or potential ally. Morrison didn't try to flatter or deceive the warlord. He simply told him that humanity had fought the Council and won. He showed Kresh footage of the battles at Epsilon Station and Tyrell Nebula. Kresh watched the footage in silence and then he laughed. It was a deep booming sound that echoed through the chamber. He told Morrison that humanity fought well for such a young species. The Vryn respected courage and tactical skill, and they had seen both in the human victories. Kresh said that the Vryn would not join humanity in war because they fought their own battles, but they would remain neutral in any future conflict between Earth and the Council. More importantly, they would share intelligence about Council military movements because they wanted to see the Council humbled. Morrison accepted these terms and returned to Earth with the agreement. Back on Earth, Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Phillips continued coordinating the defense of human space. The victory at Tyrell Nebula had bought them time, but Phillips knew the Council would eventually try again. He worked with Dr. Helen Carter and her research team to develop new weapons and defensive systems. Carter's team had been analyzing the wreckage recovered from the battle, and they had learned valuable information about Council technology. They discovered weaknesses in Zenthari shield generators and flaws in Krillian weapon systems that could be exploited in future engagements. Carter's most important discovery was a new type of faster-than-light drive that was both faster and harder to detect than anything humanity currently used. The drive worked by creating a smaller bubble of warped space which required less energy and left a smaller signature. If human ships could move faster and remain hidden longer, they would have a significant tactical advantage. Carter estimated that the new drives could be installed on existing ships within 6 months. Phillips immediately authorized the project and diverted resources to speed up production. The diplomatic successes and technological advances gave humanity breathing room, but Admiral Parker knew that the real test was still to come. The Council had been hurt but not defeated. They still had vastly superior numbers and resources. Parker needed to find a way to prevent the Council from bringing their full strength to bear against Earth. She studied intelligence, reports from the Torvani and Vryn networks, and began to see patterns in Council behavior. The Council's greatest weakness was their assumption of superiority. They had ruled the galaxy for so long that they could not imagine losing. This arrogance made them predictable and gave humanity an edge. Parker began developing a long-term strategy based on this insight. Instead of fighting pitched battles, humanity would focus on raids and ambushes that would drain Council resources and morale. They would strike at isolated outposts and supply convoys. They would make every Council victory costly and every defeat humiliating. Commander Steve Logan expanded human intelligence operations throughout Council space. He recruited agents from among the minor species who had grievances against the Council. Information began flowing back to Earth about Council fleet movements and military plans. Logan discovered that the Council was having trouble maintaining their fleet after the losses at Tyrell Nebula. Several member species were reluctant to commit more ships and resources to the war against humanity. The political fractures that had appeared after the battle were growing wider. The Qualeen, who were among the oldest members of the council, began openly questioning the war. Their representative gave a speech in the council chambers arguing that humanity had only defended itself, and that the council's aggressive stance was counterproductive. The major powers tried to silence him, but his words had been heard. Other minor species began to voice similar concerns. The council was no longer speaking with one voice, and that division was exactly what humanity needed to survive. 6 months after the Battle of Tyrell Nebula, the galaxy looked very different than it had before. The Galactic Council still existed and still claimed authority over the known worlds, but that authority was no longer absolute. Humanity had proven that the Council could be challenged and defeated. Other species watched and learned from Earth's example. The old order was crumbling and something new was taking shape in its place. Admiral Lisa Parker had become a legend across 1,000 worlds. Her name was spoken with respect by allies and with fear by enemies. She stood on the bridge of her flagship and reviewed reports from across human space. The fleet had grown significantly in the past months as new ships rolled out of Earth's shipyards equipped with the latest technology that Dr. Helen Carter's team had developed. Human colonies were expanding into territories that the Council had previously forbidden. No one tried to stop them anymore. The Council made one final attempt to resolve the situation through diplomacy. Ambassador Threll requested a meeting with President Ross and Admiral Parker in neutral space. The location was carefully chosen and monitored by both sides to prevent treachery. Commander Steve Logan personally oversaw security arrangements and made sure that human ships were positioned nearby in case the meeting was a trap. When the day came, Threll arrived aboard a diplomatic vessel escorted by 2 warships. Admiral Parker arrived with similar escort. The meeting took place aboard a neutral trading station that belonged to the Torvani. Threll entered the conference room accompanied by 2 aides, while Parker brought Commander Greg Hayes and Captain Kate Sullivan with her. President Ross attended via secure holographic link from Earth. The atmosphere was tense as both sides took their seats across from each other. Threll looked older than he had 6 months ago. The defeat and the political turmoil that followed had taken their toll on him. Threll spoke first, and his tone was very different from the arrogant demands he had made in the past. He told the humans that the Council was prepared to offer new terms. All restrictions on human expansion would be lifted immediately. The mining rights and territory that had been seized from humanity would be returned. Earth would be recognized as an equal member of the galactic community, with full voting rights in Council affairs. In exchange, the Council asked only that humanity agree to a mutual defense pact and sign a formal peace treaty that would end hostilities. Admiral Parker listened without interruption, and when Threll finished, she looked at President Ross through the holographic display. The offer was far more generous than anything the Council had proposed before. It gave humanity everything they had fought for and more. But Parker knew the real reason behind the offer. The Council was afraid. They feared that continued conflict would destroy what remained of their unity. They feared that other species would follow humanity's example and rebel. The Council was offering peace not because they respected humanity, but because they feared what would happen if the war continued. President Ross consulted with his advisors, including Lieutenant Ben Foster, who provided detailed analysis of the Council's current political situation. The younger species within the Council were already breaking away from the old power structure. The Qualeen had stopped sending ships to patrol Council borders. 3 minor species had declared neutrality in any future conflicts. The Council's authority was collapsing, and they knew it. Earth could accept the peace offer and secure a stable future, or they could press their advantage and potentially gain even more. Ross made his decision. Admiral Parker delivered Earth's response, and her words were carefully chosen. Humanity would accept the peace treaty and the recognition of equal status. Earth would take back the territories and rights that had been stolen from them. But humanity would not join a mutual defense pact with the Council. Earth would remain independent and free to make its own alliances and pursue its own interests. The Council could accept these terms or the war would continue. Parker made it clear that humanity was no longer afraid of the Council and would not compromise on their independence. Threll was silent for a long moment. The other Council members had authorized him to negotiate, but they had expected humanity to accept the Mutual Defense Pact. Without that pact, the Council gained nothing from the peace treaty except an end to a war they were losing. But Threll was a realist, and he understood that he had no leverage left. The Council could reject Earth's terms and continue fighting. but that would only accelerate their decline. He accepted the terms and the treaty was signed that same day. News of the peace treaty spread across the galaxy within hours. Humanity had not only survived their conflict with the Council, but had emerged as an independent power that answered to no one. The Torvani celebrated because their alliance with Earth had proven profitable, and would become even more so now that trade restrictions were lifted. The Vryn Collective sent a message of congratulations and offered to establish formal diplomatic relations. Dozens of other species reached out to Earth seeking trade agreements and alliances. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the newly commissioned flagship Independence and looked out at the stars. The ship was the most advanced vessel humanity had ever built, incorporating all the lessons learned from the war. Morrison had been promoted to admiral and given command of the exploration fleet that would push into uncharted regions of space. Humanity was no longer confined to the small corner of the galaxy that the Council had allowed them. The entire universe was open to them now. Commander Claire Hughes became Earth's chief ambassador and established diplomatic offices on a dozen worlds. She negotiated trade agreements that brought wealth flowing into human space. The Torvani merchants, who had been early allies of humanity, prospered alongside Earth. Other species who had suffered under Council rule looked to the human example and began asserting their own independence. The galaxy was entering a new era where power was more evenly distributed. Dr. Helen Carter continued her research, and her discoveries revolutionized human technology. The new faster-than-light drives allowed human ships to travel farther and faster than ever before. Within 2 years of the peace treaty, Earth had established colonies in 3 new sectors. The human population exploded as people rushed to settle new worlds. Captain Morrison led expeditions that discovered habitable planets and made first contact with species that had never encountered the Council. The Galactic Council still existed, but it was a shadow of its former self. The Xanthari and Krillians maintained their alliance, but their influence had diminished significantly. The minor species that had once followed their lead now made their own decisions. Some left the Council entirely while others remained, but refused to contribute military forces or pay the tributes that had once filled Council coffers. The age of Council dominance was over. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Phillips retired from active military service and became an instructor at Earth's War College. He taught the next generation of officers about the principles that had won humanity's freedom. Never accept oppression without resistance. Never surrender when you have the strength to fight. Never negotiate from a position of weakness. His students would carry those lessons with them as they served in the expanding human fleet. Admiral Parker eventually retired as well and returned to Earth. She had led humanity through its darkest hour and had refused to bargain when the Council had pushed too far. Her legacy would endure for generations. Young officers studied her tactics and politicians quoted her speeches. She had shown the galaxy that humanity would bow to no one. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Independence as it prepared to jump to an unexplored system. His crew was ready, and the ship's systems were functioning perfectly. He gave the order, and the Independence leaped into faster-than-light travel. Behind them, Earth continued to grow and prosper. Ahead of them lay infinite possibilities. Humanity had earned its freedom through courage and sacrifice. Now they would build a future worthy of that price. The galaxy had pushed them too far, and humanity had pushed back. The age of human submission was over, and the age of human ascendancy had begun.